The train whistle pierced the quiet Montana afternoon as Madeline Miller clutched her single valise, heart pounding with anticipation and fear. After 3 months of correspondence and a journey of over 2,000 miles, she had finally arrived in Val Verde, Montana Territory, in the summer of 1875, ready to meet the man who would become her husband. At 22, she had left behind everything familiar in Boston for the promise of a new life with a cattle rancher named Edmund Parker, a widower seeking a companion through a mail-order bride advertisement that had caught her eye during a moment of desperate courage. The platform was bustling with activity as Madeline smoothed down her travel-worn blue dress, scanning the crowd for a man matching the vague description she had been provided. Her chestnut hair was coming loose from its pins after the long journey, and she felt the weight of exhaustion in her bones. Yet the excitement of finally arriving kept her alert, watching each approaching figure with nervous anticipation. Miss Miller. A thin, elderly gentleman approached, removing his hat. "I'm Harold Winters, Mr. Parker's business associate." "Yes, that's me," Madeline confirmed, relief washing over her. "How wonderful to meet you. Is Mr. Parker unable to come himself?" The man's expression tightened, and he glanced away momentarily. "I'm afraid there's been a complication, Miss Miller. Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private. May I take your bag?" A cold sensation settled in Madeline's stomach as she handed over her valise. Mr. Winters led her to a small tea shop adjacent to the station, ordering 2 cups before settling across from her at a corner table. The establishment was mercifully quiet, with only a few other patrons present. "I regret to inform you," Mr. Winters began, his voice low and uncomfortable, "that Mr. Parker has married another woman." The word struck Madeline like a physical blow. "Married? But I don't understand. Our arrangements were clear." "I have his letters." "Yes. Well," Mr. Winters shifted uncomfortably. "A local widow with substantial property adjoining his ranch became available for marriage about a month ago. Mr. Parker saw a strategic opportunity and acted quickly. He asked me to meet you and explain the situation. He's provided funds for your return journey to Boston, of course." Madeline's hands trembled around her teacup. "I see." The simple words belied the storm of emotions within her: shock, humiliation, and the sudden, terrifying realization that she had nowhere to go. Her family home had been sold to pay debts after her father's death. Her position as a schoolteacher had been filled. She had burned her bridges, confident in the future promised in those carefully penned letters. "Miss Miller, please understand." "What I understand," Madeline interrupted with surprising steadiness, "is that I have traveled across the country to fulfill an agreement that Mr. Parker has callously broken. What I don't understand is what I'm supposed to do now." Mr. Winters slid an envelope across the table. "This should cover your expenses home and provide some compensation for your trouble." Before Madeline could respond, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Excuse my interruption, but I couldn't help overhearing." Madeline turned to find a tall man standing near their table, his broad shoulders filling out a simple work shirt, a weathered Stetson held respectfully in calloused hands. His face was tanned from long days under the sun, with striking blue eyes and a square jaw shadowed with stubble. Despite his rough appearance, there was a gentleness in his expression that made her pause. "Yates Morgan," Mr. Winters acknowledged with a nod. "This is a private matter." "Appears to be a matter of honor to me," the man Yates replied, his voice carrying a hint of steel beneath its polite tone. His gaze moved to Madeline, softening as it met hers. "Miss, I run the Double M Ranch about 5 miles outside of town. I've been looking for someone to help with the house and the books. It's not what you came for, I expect, but it's honest work with fair pay until you decide what you want to do." Mr. Winters frowned. "Morgan, this isn't your concern." "I believe the lady can make her own decisions," Yates responded, never taking his eyes off Madeline. "The way I see it, if Parker broke his promise, then you've been released from yours. You're free to choose your own path now." Madeline studied him, this unexpected stranger offering an alternative to her predicament. There was something forthright in his gaze, a sincerity that seemed out of place in this moment of betrayal. "You're offering me employment," she clarified, needing to understand exactly what was being proposed. Yates nodded. "Room, board, and wages. My housekeeper left to care for her ailing sister 3 weeks ago. Place is showing it." A small, self-deprecating smile appeared. "I'm not much at keeping books either." "Mr. Morgan," Mr. Winters interjected, "Miss Miller is a respectable woman from Boston. She can't simply move into a bachelor's home. There would be talk." "My sister lives with me," Yates countered smoothly. "Elizabeth is 26 and as proper as they come." No impropriety and no cause for gossip. Madeline's mind raced. The alternative was returning to Boston with nothing and no one waiting for her, using Edmund Parker's gilt money to establish herself anew. The humiliation of that prospect burned almost as much as the betrayal. "Then you're free to choose me," Yates said quietly, the words not a demand but an acknowledgement of her liberty. "Or not. But you have options beyond what Parker's offering." Madeline looked down at the envelope on the table, then back up at the unexpected cowboy with his direct gaze and unexpected kindness. In that moment, standing at the crossroads of what her life could become, she made her decision. "I believe I would like to accept your offer of employment, Mr. Morgan," she said, rising from her chair. "At least temporarily while I consider my next steps." Relief and something else flickered across Yates' face. "Call me Yates, Miss Miller. Welcome to Val Verde." As they left the tea shop, Mr. Winters hurrying after them with protestations that went unheeded, Madeline felt a strange sensation beneath her anxiety and disappointment, a flicker of something that felt remarkably like hope. Yates helped Madeline into his wagon after securing her valise, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The bustle of Val Verde surrounded them, a growing cattle town, with wooden sidewalks fronting establishments ranging from saloons to a surprisingly well-appointed dry goods store. People moved with purpose, many nodding respectfully to Yates as they passed. "You seem well known," Madeline observed, grateful for any conversation to distract from her tumultuous thoughts. "Been here since '67, Yates explained, guiding the horses through the main street. "Came west after the war with nothing but determination and my younger sister to look after. Started as a ranch hand, saved every penny, and eventually bought my own place." He glanced at her. "Not a grand story, but an honest one." "Honesty seems increasingly valuable," Madeline replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Yates was quiet for a moment. "Parker's a fool," he finally said. "Begging your pardon for speaking plainly." "No apology needed for truth," Madeline said. "Though I wonder what that makes me, traveling across the country to marry a man I'd never met." "Brave," Yates answered immediately. "Takes courage to leave everything familiar behind for a chance at something better." His simple assessment soothed something raw within her. They continued in companionable silence as the wagon left town, following a winding road that climbed gently through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers. Cattle grazed in the distance, and the vast Montana sky stretched endlessly above them. Despite her circumstances, Madeline couldn't help but be struck by the rugged beauty surrounding them. "It's breathtaking," she murmured. "That it is," Yates agreed, his voice warm. "First time I saw this country, I knew I'd never want to leave it. Hard living sometimes, but worth every struggle." After about an hour's journey, they crested a hill, and the Double M Ranch came into view. A sturdy two-story house painted white with green trim stood proudly amid several outbuildings. A large barn, corrals, and a bunkhouse completed the main compound, with endless pasture land stretching beyond. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory," Yates said, a note of pride in his voice, "but it's good land and we're growing every year." As they approached, a slender woman with honey-blonde hair emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She waved enthusiastically when she spotted the wagon. "That's Elizabeth," Yates explained. "Best sister a man could ask for. Gave up a lot to follow me out here." Elizabeth was waiting as they pulled up to the house, her curious expression turning to surprise as she noticed Madeline. "Yates Morgan, what have you done now?" she asked, though her tone held more amusement than censure. Yates jumped down from the wagon and helped Madeline descend before turning to his sister. "Elizabeth, this is Miss Madeline Miller. She's going to be helping us with the house and books for a while. Miss Miller, my sister Elizabeth." "It's lovely to meet you," Madeline said, suddenly self-conscious of her travel-worn appearance. Elizabeth's eyes widened in recognition. "You're Edmund Parker's mail-order bride, aren't you?" "The one arriving on today's train," Madeline tensed. "I was, yes. How did you know?" "Small town," Elizabeth explained sympathetically. "Word travels, but what happened? Why are you here instead of with Edmund?" "It seems Mr. Parker found a more advantageous match," Madeline replied stiffly. Elizabeth's face clouded with indignation. "That horrible man! I'd heard rumors about Margaret Wilson, but I never thought he'd be callous enough to." She stopped abruptly, taking Madeline's hands in hers. "You poor dear, what a terrible welcome to Val Verde." "Your brother kindly offered employment when he overheard my predicament," Madeline explained. Elizabeth shot Yates a look that seemed to contain equal parts exasperation and approval before turning back to Madeline with a warm smile. "Well, his timing was finally good for something. Come inside. You must be exhausted." The interior of the Morgan home was surprisingly comfortable, with sturdy furniture arranged practically around a large stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, more books than Madeline would have expected in a ranch house. While not fancy, everything was of good quality, though she could see the evidence of a household missing a woman's touch in the disorganized stacks of papers on the desk, and the layer of dust on some surfaces. "It's not much compared to Boston, I imagine," Yates said, setting her valise down in the entryway. "It's lovely," Madeline replied sincerely. "Reminds me of my grandparents' home in Vermont." Elizabeth showed Madeline to a pleasant bedroom on the second floor, with windows overlooking the eastern pastures and distant mountains. "This was our aunt's room when she visited," Elizabeth explained. "She passed last year. The wardrobe is empty if you'd like to unpack." When they returned downstairs, Yates was setting the table while a pot of stew bubbled on the stove. The domestic sight of this rugged cowboy carefully arranging plates brought an unexpected smile to Madeline's lips. "Don't let appearances fool you," Elizabeth whispered conspiratorially. "He's hopeless in the kitchen. That stew was made yesterday by Mrs. Holloway from town. She comes once a week to cook meals we can reheat. Dinner was a simple affair, but the food was hearty and the company unexpectedly pleasant." Yates explained the ranch operations while Elizabeth filled in details about the community. They tactfully avoided discussing Edmund Parker, focusing instead on making Madeline feel welcome. "I should explain your duties," Yates said as they finished eating. "Nothing too taxing. Keeping the house in order, managing correspondence, keeping the accounts straight. I've been trying, but numbers aren't my strong suit. Yates can run 1,000-head cattle operation but can't balance a simple ledger," Elizabeth teased. He rolled his eyes good-naturedly. Different skills, Lizzie. To Madeline, he continued, you'll have Sundays to yourself, of course, and Saturday afternoons if you wish. As for wages, would $15 a month suit you, plus room and board, naturally? Madeline nearly choked on her water. It was a generous offer for a housekeeper, especially with accommodations included. That's more than fair. Good, Yates nodded decisively. You can start whenever you feel ready, no rush after your journey. Later that evening, as Madeline unpacked her meager belongings, Elizabeth knocked gently on her door. I brought you some extra blankets, she said, entering when invited. Nights can get chilly even in summer. She hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bed. I wanted to make sure you're truly comfortable with this arrangement. My brother means well, but he sometimes acts before thinking through all the implications. Madeline paused in hanging a dress. You're concerned about my reputation. Partly that, Elizabeth acknowledged, but also about you. You've had quite a shock today. Are you really all right? The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid Madeline's carefully maintained composure. She sat heavily beside Elizabeth, her hands trembling slightly. I don't know, she admitted softly. I left everything behind for a man who discarded me without even the courtesy of telling me himself. I feel foolish and humiliated and... She swallowed hard. And I don't know what happens next. Elizabeth took her hand. Next, you sleep in a safe place. Tomorrow, you begin a respectable job. The future beyond that doesn't need deciding tonight. Madeline nodded, grateful for the practical kindness. Your brother, he seems like a good man. The best, Elizabeth confirmed without hesitation. Stubborn as they come and works too hard, but he's never forgotten what matters. She squeezed Madeline's hand before rising. Rest now. Things often look clearer in the morning. After Elizabeth left, Madeline moved to the window, gazing out at the Montana night. Stars blanketed the sky in numbers she'd never seen in Boston, brilliant against the darkness. Below, she could make out Yates' silhouette as he made a final check of the barn. Something about his steady movements, the careful way he secured the door, spoke of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. She thought of Edmund Parker, who had not, and felt a curious sense of fate in the day's events. Not destiny, she was too pragmatic for such notions, but perhaps a redirection to where she needed to be, even if it wasn't where she had planned to go. With that comforting thought, she prepared for bed, exhaustion finally claiming her as she slipped between cool sheets, the distant sounds of night birds and the occasional lowing of cattle creating an unfamiliar, but somehow soothing lullaby. Dawn broke early on the Montana prairie, sunlight streaming through windows that Madeline had forgotten to cover with the provided curtains. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was then. Yesterday's events came rushing back. The train, Mr. Winter's uncomfortable explanation, and the unexpected cowboy who had offered an alternative to humiliating defeat. She dressed quickly in a practical gray dress, pinning her hair into a simple but neat style. If she was to be a housekeeper, she would be a proper one, determined to earn her keep and prove her worth to the Morgans and to herself. Downstairs, she found the kitchen empty, but a fire already lit in the stove and coffee brewing. Through the window, she could see ranch hands moving about the yard and Yates by the corral, deep in conversation with an older man. As she watched, he threw back his head and laughed at something said, the sound carrying faintly through the glass. The sight of his unguarded smile caused an unexpected flutter in her chest that she quickly dismissed. Good morning. Elizabeth bustled in from outside, carrying a basket of eggs. I hope you slept well. Very well, thank you, Madeline replied, moving to take the basket. Please, let me help with breakfast. Together, they prepared a simple meal of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Elizabeth proved to be an amiable companion, explaining the rhythm of ranch life as they worked. The men ate at the bunkhouse, she explained, except for Yates and the foreman, Frank Donnelly, who often joined them at the main house to discuss the day's work. As if summoned by the mention, Yates and an older, weathered man entered just as they were setting the table. "Morning, Miss Miller," Yates greeted her, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "This is Frank Donnelly, been with me since the beginning." "Pleasure, madam," Frank said with a respectful nod. "Welcome to Double M." Breakfast conversation centered on ranch business, cattle needing movement to fresh pasture, a fence section requiring repair, supplies to be ordered from town. Madeline listened attentively, mentally cataloging information that might be relevant to her new duties. "I'd like to show Miss Miller the books after breakfast," Yates said to Elizabeth as they finished eating. "Then perhaps you could familiarize her with the house." "Of course," Elizabeth agreed. "Though I warn you, Madeline, his record-keeping system is an adventure in creative organization." Yates led Madeline to a small study off the main room, where a roll-top desk stood surrounded by bookshelves. As promised, the desk was cluttered with papers, leather-bound ledgers, and unopened mail. "It's a mess," he admitted, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of embarrassment. "Been meaning to sort it, but between spring calving and expanding the north pasture." He trailed off with a shrug. "I'm sure I can bring it to order," Madeline assured him, already assessing the challenge before her. "May I examine the ledgers?" For the next hour, Yates explained the ranch operations as Madeline paged through the account books. Despite Elizabeth's teasing, the basic system was sound if poorly maintained. Expenses were recorded but not categorized. Income was noted but not balanced against outlay. Still, she could see the underlying prosperity of the operation. The Double M was clearly thriving under Yates' management. "This looks manageable," she said finally, closing the most recent ledger. "I taught arithmetic at a girls' school in Boston. Accounting isn't so different." "You were a teacher?" Yates asked, seeming genuinely interested. Madeline nodded. "For 3 years after finishing my education. It was satisfying work." She hesitated, then added, "My father's death changed our circumstances. The school had been generous in allowing me to live at home to care for him, but afterward, with the house sold to settle debts, there was no accommodation for an unmarried teacher." "So you answered Parker's advertisement," Yates concluded, his expression softening. "Yes." "It seemed a practical solution," Madeline replied, surprised by her own candor. "I had no romantic notions about mail-order marriages. It was to be a partnership of mutual benefit." Yates studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Practical doesn't mean without hope, Miss Miller. Partnerships built on respect can grow into something deeper, given time and care." The simple sincerity of his words touched something within her. Before she could respond, however, Elizabeth appeared at the doorway. "If you're finished with the financial education, Yates, I'd like to show Madeline the rest of the house." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of domestic orientation. Elizabeth was a patient guide, showing Madeline the household systems where linens were stored, how the pump in the kitchen worked, which floorboards creaked, and which windows stuck in humid weather. The house was substantial but not extravagant, built with comfort and practicality in mind. "Yates designed it himself," Elizabeth explained as they folded sheets in the upstairs hallway. "Made sure there were plenty of bookshelves for my collection and windows positioned to catch both morning and afternoon light. He pretends it's just a place to sleep, but he put his heart into this house." By evening, Madeline had established a mental inventory of what needed attention most urgently. The study's reorganization, a thorough dusting throughout, mending of several torn curtains, and proper sorting of the pantry supplies. The tasks were straightforward, the kind of work that would keep her hands and mind occupied while she determined her next steps. Supper was a simple affair of reheated stew and fresh bread that Elizabeth had baked that afternoon. Yates returned late, apologizing for the delay. A heifer had gotten herself stuck in a muddy creek bed, requiring rescue. "I've drawn up a schedule," Madeline told him as they ate. "If it meets with your approval, I'd like to begin with organizing the study and bringing the accounts up to date." "I trust your judgment," Yates replied, looking slightly amused. "No need to seek approval for every decision. This is your domain now." "Not mine," Madeline corrected quickly. "I'm merely an employee." Something flickered in Yates' expression, too quickly to interpret. "Of course," he said easily. "Still, I hired you for your competence. No need to report on every detail." The next week established a pattern. Madeline rose early, prepared breakfast with Elizabeth, then set to work on the house while Yates and the ranch hands tended to their outdoor responsibilities. The physical labor was actually welcome after months of anxiety and the strain of her journey. There was satisfaction in bringing order to chaos, in seeing tangible results from her efforts. By the fourth day, the study had been transformed from a cluttered mess to an efficient workspace. Ledgers were properly organized, correspondence sorted by urgency, and supplies neatly arranged. Yates' surprise when he saw it brought an unexpected warmth of pride to Madeline's chest. "I hardly recognize it," he remarked, running his hand along the now polished desktop. "You work miracles, Miss Miller." "Hardly miracles," she demurred. "Just organization." He smiled, the expression softening the rugged planes of his face. "Still seems miraculous to me." With the study complete, Madeline turned her attention to the rest of the house. Each room received thorough attention: windows washed, floors scrubbed, furniture polished. Elizabeth helped when she could, but much of her time was occupied with the vegetable garden and chicken coop, as well as the occasional nursing of sick calves that Yates brought to the barn for special care. The rhythm of ranch life began to seep into Madeline's bones, the predictable unpredictability of days governed by weather and animals and seasons rather than clocks and appointments. There was freedom in it that she hadn't expected, a sense of purpose that had been lacking in her Boston existence. On Sunday morning, just over a week after her arrival, Yates approached her as she sat on the front porch, enjoying a rare moment of leisure with a book borrowed from Elizabeth's collection. "We're heading into town for services," he said, looking uncharacteristically formal in a clean shirt and vest. "Would you care to join us?" The invitation presented a dilemma. While Madeline had attended church regularly in Boston, the prospect of facing Val Verde society, where rumors of her situation had surely spread, was daunting. "I'm not certain that would be wise," she replied carefully, "given the circumstances of my arrival." Yates frowned slightly. "You've done nothing to be ashamed of, Miss Miller." "Perhaps not, but I have no desire to be the subject of town gossip." He considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I understand, but you should know that Val Verde isn't Boston. Folks here judge by actions more than circumstances." "When you're ready, you'll find most welcoming enough." Something in his steady confidence made her reconsider. "Perhaps next week," she conceded. "I'll hold you to that," Yates replied with a small smile. "In the meantime, would you like me to bring anything back for you?" "The general store is open after services." The thoughtfulness of the offer touched her. "Some writing paper if it's not too much trouble. I should write to my friend Charlotte in Boston to let her know my change in situation." "Consider it done," he promised. After the Morgans departed for town, Madeline found herself alone at the ranch for the first time. The silence was both peaceful and strange after a lifetime spent in busy Boston, and then a week in a working household. She used the solitude to explore the house more thoroughly, noting repairs needed and improvements possible. In Yates' bedroom entered briefly and respectfully for the sole purpose of gathering laundry. She paused at the sight of a small framed photograph on his dresser. It showed a much younger Yates in a Union Army uniform, standing proud and serious beside a seated older couple who must have been his parents. She resisted the urge to examine it more closely, feeling she had already intruded too much on his privacy. The Morgans returned mid-afternoon, bringing not only the requested writing paper but also a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A welcome gift," Elizabeth explained, handing it to Madeline, "since you missed your proper welcome to Val Verde." Inside was a lovely blue hair ribbon and a small bottle of lavender water. "Elizabeth chose them," Yates said, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Said every lady needs small luxuries." "They're perfect," Madeline replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you both." "Also," Yates continued, "we've been invited to the Hargrove Ranch for dinner next Saturday. Daniel Hargrove is our nearest neighbor about 5 miles west. His wife Sarah specifically asked that you join us." Madeline hesitated. "Are you certain that's appropriate?" "I'm your housekeeper, not a family member. You're our friend," Elizabeth corrected firmly. "And out here, lines between employee and family blur quickly. Ranch life requires it. Besides," Yates added, "Sarah Hargrove was a mail-order bride herself 8 years ago. She'd likely appreciate meeting you regardless of your current position." This unexpected connection piqued Madeline's interest. "In that case, I'd be pleased to accept." That evening after dinner, Madeline sat at the kitchen table writing to Charlotte while Elizabeth mended a shirt, and Yates cleaned his rifle nearby. The domestic scene struck her suddenly how quickly she had adapted to this household, how comfortable the silence between them had become. It was nothing like what she had imagined her life in Montana would be. Yet there was a contentment in it that she couldn't deny. In her letter, she explained the situation honestly but without bitterness, describing her new position and the unexpected kindness of the Morgans. She didn't mention the way Yates' rare smile made her heart beat faster, or how his quiet competence and integrity had begun to heal the wound of Edmund Parker's betrayal. Some things, she decided, were better left unwritten until she understood them better herself. The days leading up to the Hargrove dinner passed quickly. Madeline continued her work around the house, while also helping Elizabeth preserve vegetables from the garden, a skill she'd never needed in Boston, but found surprisingly satisfying. Yates was often gone from dawn until dusk, returning tired but usually taking time to ask about her day or share some observation about the ranch. On Wednesday evening, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley, bringing spectacular lightning and much-needed rain. The three of them sat on the covered porch watching nature's display, drinking hot tea as thunder rattled the windows. "I've always loved storms," Elizabeth remarked, wrapped in a shawl against the cooler air. "They remind me that there are forces greater than human concerns." "I prefer calmer weather," Yates countered. "Predictable and manageable." "You can't manage everything, brother," Elizabeth teased. "Some things must simply be experienced." Madeline smiled at their familiar banter. In Boston, storms meant flooded streets and ruined outings. Here they seem magnificent, elemental. "That's Montana for you," Yates said, his voice warm with affection for his adopted home. "Everything's more intense. The storms, the sunshine, the winters." He glanced at her. "Takes a special kind of person to thrive here." "What kind is that?" Madeline asked, genuinely curious. He considered for a moment. "Resilient, adaptable, someone who sees challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles. His blue eyes met hers. Someone like you. The compliment caught her off guard, warming her from within despite the cool rain-scented air. Before she could respond, a particularly loud thunderclap made them all start, then laugh at their shared reaction, the moment passing into comfortable conversation about less revealing topics. Saturday arrived bright and clear. Madeline selected her best dress, a forest green with minimal ornamentation that had been impractical for ranch work, but was perfectly suitable for dinner with neighbors. She wore her hair partially up, secured with the blue ribbon from Elizabeth's gift, and allowed herself a small dab of the lavender water at her wrists and throat. When she descended the stairs, Yates was waiting by the front door. He looked up at her approach, and something in his expression made her self-conscious. "Is something wrong?" she asked, smoothing her skirt nervously. "No," he replied quickly. "Just, you look very nice, Miss Miller." "Thank you," she said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "And please, after all this time, I think you might call me Madeline." A slow smile spread across his face. "Madeline, then, and I'm Yates to my friends." Elizabeth joined them, breaking the moment with practical concerns about bringing Sarah Hargrove's favorite apple preserves, and whether they should take the good wagon or the everyday one. The Hargrove Ranch was smaller than Double M but meticulously maintained, with a comfortable one-story house surrounded by well-tended gardens. Sarah Hargrove, a petite woman with striking red hair, greeted them warmly at the door while her husband, a tall man with a booming voice, took Yates aside immediately to show him a new breeding bull. "Men and their cattle," Sarah laughed, leading the women inside. "Come in. I've been so eager to meet you, Madeline." News travels quickly in Val Verde. To Madeline's relief, Sarah's interest seemed born of genuine sympathy rather than gossip-seeking. As they helped prepare the final touches for dinner, Sarah shared her own story of coming west from Philadelphia as a mail-order bride. "I was terrified," she admitted, arranging biscuits in a basket. "I'd never been further west than Pittsburgh, and suddenly I was traveling to Montana Territory to marry a stranger." "Were you disappointed?" Madeline asked, thinking of her own experience. Sarah's expression softened. "No, though surprised. Daniel's letters had been so formal, I expected someone stern and humorless. Instead, I found this laughing bear of a man who recited poetry while mending fences." She glanced toward the window where their husbands could be seen deep in conversation by the corral. "Sometimes the reality is better than what we imagine, even when it's not what we expected." The dinner was delightful roast beef, fresh vegetables, and a berry pie that Sarah apologized for despite its perfection. Conversation flowed easily, with Daniel sharing amusing stories of the early days of ranching in the territory, and Elizabeth updating Sarah on mutual acquaintances in town. "So, Madeline," Daniel said as they enjoyed coffee after the meal, "Yates tells me you've performed miracles with his accounting system." Madeline smiled. "Hardly miracles, just basic organization." "She's being modest," Yates interjected. "I can actually find things now, and the ledgers balance for the first time in years." "A valuable skill," Daniel nodded approvingly. "Sarah keeps our books. I'd be lost without her business sense." "Daniel likes to pretend he's just a simple cattleman," Sarah explained with fond exasperation. "But he was educated at Yale before coming west. He can calculate the profit margin on a herd faster than anyone I know." "A man contains multitudes," Daniel said with a wink. "Just like our friend Yates here, rancher, carpenter, veteran, and the best horseman in 3 counties. Now who's exaggerating?" Yates protested, though Madeline noticed a pleased flush on his tanned face. The conversation turned to community matters, the need for a proper schoolhouse in Val Verde, the upcoming Harvest Festival, and the territorial governor's recent visit to the county seat. Madeline found herself drawn into discussions easily, her opinions sought and respected in a way that made her feel included rather than merely tolerated. As they prepared to leave, Sarah pulled Madeline aside. "I hope you'll call on me sometime," she said warmly. "It's good to have another Easterner to talk with occasionally." "I'd like that," Madeline replied, realizing she meant it. Perhaps there was a place for her in this community after all, regardless of how she had arrived. On the drive home, under a spectacular canopy of stars, Madeline found herself seated beside Yates on the wagon bench, with Elizabeth dozing in the back. The night was cool but not cold, with crickets creating a symphony around them and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves on the packed earth road. "Thank you for including me tonight," Madeline said softly, not wanting to disturb Elizabeth. "The Hargroves are lovely people." "They are," Yates agreed. "Daniel helped me when I was just starting out, taught me a lot about ranching and being a good neighbor." He glanced at her. "Did you enjoy yourself very much? It's been a long time since I felt so welcomed." Yates was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "Val Verde has its flaws, but people generally look out for each other here. Once you're accepted, you're family." "And am I?" Madeline asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "Accepted?" In the moonlight, she could see the corner of his mouth lift in a small smile. "I'd say so. Sarah Hargrove doesn't invite just anyone to call on her." He hesitated, then added more seriously, "And the Double M has felt more like a home since you arrived." The simple statement, delivered without flourish, affected Madeline more deeply than flowery compliments ever could have. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the weight of his words settling around her like a warm blanket against the cool night air. The following weeks saw Madeline's role at the ranch expand beyond simple housekeeping. As she mastered the accounts, Yates began consulting her on financial decisions, valuing her mathematical precision and practical perspective. She accompanied Elizabeth to town for supplies, gradually meeting more of the Val Verde community and finding, to her relief, that most people treated her with courtesy rather than speculation. True to her word, she attended church services the next Sunday, sitting between the Morgan siblings and enduring the curious glances with quiet dignity. Afterward, Yates introduced her to several neighbors and the minister, his hand supportively at the small of her back as they navigated the social interactions. "You did well," he told her as they rode home. "First time's always the hardest." "It wasn't as difficult as I expected," Madeline admitted, "though I could have done without Mrs. Tanner's obvious assessment of my hat." Elizabeth laughed. "Mildred Tanner judges everyone's hats. Last week she told the minister's wife that her bonnet looked like something a saint Louis' showgirl would reject." "Terrible woman," Yates said, though his tone held more amusement than censure. "Been terrorizing the community with her opinions for 20 years." These small shared moments, jokes over breakfast, the exchanging of meaningful glances when the general store owner overcharged for sugar, the comfortable silences as they sat on the porch in the evenings began to weave a connection between Madeline and the Morgans that transcended her position as an employee. Without quite realizing it, she stopped thinking of Boston as home and began considering her future in Montana. August brought the height of summer heat and increased activity at the ranch, as preparations began for the fall cattle drive. Yates spent long days in the saddle, often returning after Madeline and Elizabeth had retired for the night. Still, he made a point of joining them for breakfast each morning, discussing ranch business and community happenings before heading out again. One particularly hot afternoon, As Madeline was hanging laundry behind the house, she heard a commotion from the direction of the corral. Setting down her basket, she hurried around the building to see several ranch hands gathered around something on the ground. Yates, she realized with a jolt of fear. "What happened?" she demanded, pushing through to kneel beside him. He was conscious but grimacing in pain, his right arm held awkwardly against his chest. "Fool horse threw me," he explained through gritted teeth. "Stepped in a prairie dog hole." Frank Donnelly, looking concerned, explained further. "New gelding spooked when his leg gave out." Boss went over his head and landed hard. "Let's get him inside," Madeline said decisively, her worry manifesting as efficient action. With Frank and another hand's help, they managed to get Yates into the house and seated in the kitchen, where better light allowed examination of his injury. "I need to check your arm," Madeline told him, carefully helping him remove his shirt. The task was awkward and clearly painful for him, revealing an already bruising shoulder and a forearm that was swelling visibly. "Doesn't look broken," Frank observed. "Probably just a bad sprain." "We should still have Dr. Collins look at it," Madeline insisted, gently probing the injured area and noting Yates' sharp intake of breath. "Frank, could someone ride for him?" "Already sent Jimmy," Frank assured her. "Doc should be here within the hour." Elizabeth, returning from town to find the household in disarray, took charge of brewing willow bark tea for the pain while Madeline prepared cold compresses for the swelling. Throughout it all, Yates maintained a stoic expression, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed his discomfort. "This isn't necessary," he protested as Madeline carefully wrapped his arm. "I've had worse." "That doesn't mean you shouldn't be properly cared for now," she replied firmly. "Hold still." Something in her tone must have conveyed that argument was futile, as Yates subsided with only a small huff of frustration. When Dr. Collins arrived, a jovial older man with spectacles and a reassuring manner, he confirmed Frank's assessment. A severely sprained shoulder and wrist, painful but not broken. "Rest it completely for at least 3 days, the doctor instructed, fashioning a proper sling. "Then limited use for another week. No riding, no roping, no lifting." Yates looked as though the prescription was worse than the injury. "I can't just sit idle for days, Doc. We're preparing for the fall drive." "You can and you will," Dr. Collins replied sternly. "Unless you want permanent damage." "I'll make sure he follows orders," Madeline promised. Ignoring Yates' look of betrayal after the doctor left, Frank assured Yates that the ranch hands could manage the preparations without him for a few days. "Nothing that can't wait, boss. Better to heal proper than rush back and make it worse." Yates reluctantly agreed, though his frustration was palpable as he was settled in the parlor with pillows supporting his injured arm. Elizabeth, needed at a church committee meeting in town, left Madeline to supervise their patient after extracting a promise from her brother to behave reasonably. "I don't need watching like a child," Yates grumbled after Elizabeth departed. "Of course not," Madeline agreed mildly, settling into a nearby chair with mending. "You're a grown man fully capable of following medical advice without supervision." He narrowed his eyes at her tone. "You don't believe that for a minute." "I believe you're stubborn enough to injure yourself further out of impatience," she replied honestly, "which would only extend your recovery and cause more disruption to the ranch." Yates sighed, knowing she was right. "I've never been good at sitting still." "Then we'll have to find ways to occupy you that don't involve your arm." Madeline set aside her sewing. "Would you like me to read to you? Elizabeth has quite the library." The suggestion seemed to surprise him, then intrigue him. "Been a long time since anyone read to me." "What do you have in mind?" Madeline selected a volume of Mark Twain's shorter works, and soon they were both chuckling at the author's wry observations. She read for nearly an hour, occasionally glancing up to find Yates watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, something softer than his usual pragmatic focus. The next few days established a new rhythm. Madeline balanced her regular duties with caring for Yates, who proved to be an unexpectedly compliant patient once he accepted the necessity of rest. They spent hours in conversation, discovering shared interests in history and literature, debating territorial politics, and exchanging stories of their respective upbringings. Yates spoke of growing up in western Pennsylvania, his father a blacksmith who had instilled in him both practical skills and a love of learning. The Civil War had interrupted his education, sending him to fight for the Union at 18. After the war, with their parents dead from influenza and Elizabeth needing support, he had decided to seek opportunity in the West rather than return to school. "No regrets?" Madeline asked as they sat on the porch one evening, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in fiery hues. Yates considered the question seriously. About coming west? None. About some choices along the way? A few. He adjusted his position carefully to avoid jostling his injured arm. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves. "That's certainly true," Madeline agreed, thinking of her own unexpected journey. "I never imagined myself in Montana. Are you sorry about how things turned out with Parker?" The question was asked gently, without pressure. Madeline found herself answering honestly. "Not anymore. At first I felt humiliated and adrift, but now—" She gestured toward the expansive landscape before them. "I found something here I didn't know I was looking for." "And what's that?" Yates asked, his voice low. She turned to meet his gaze, finding it steady and warm. "Purpose. Belonging. The freedom to discover who I am outside of others' expectations." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. "Montana has a way of revealing people's true natures. Some find it too harsh, too demanding. Others discover they're stronger than they knew. And which am I?" Madeline asked, suddenly needing to know how he saw her. "Definitely the latter," he replied without hesitation. "You arrived here facing heartbreak and humiliation, yet within weeks you've created a place for yourself through sheer determination and grace." His good hand moved slightly, as if he might reach for hers, then stilled. "It's remarkable." The quiet admiration in his voice touched something deep within her. For a breathless moment, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Then the dinner bell rang from inside Elizabeth, summoning them to the evening meal, and the moment passed, though the warmth it had kindled remained. By the following week, Yates had recovered enough to resume light duties, though he chafed at the continuing restrictions on riding and roping. Madeline found herself missing their long conversations, even as she recognized the importance of his return to ranch work. Something had shifted between them during those days of enforced proximity, a deepening connection that went beyond employer and employee, beyond even friendship, into territory Madeline wasn't quite ready to name. September arrived with cooler mornings and the golden light that heralded autumn. The cattle drive to the railroad at Miles City was scheduled for the third week of the month, and preparations intensified across the ranch. Yates, fully recovered from his injury, spent long days working with the hands to ensure everything was ready. "I'll be gone about 2 weeks," he explained over dinner one evening. "Frank and I will take 6 hands with us. The rest will stay to manage things here." "Will it be dangerous?" Madeline asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the worry that had immediately blossomed at the thought of him being gone so long. Yates shrugged. "Always some risk with a drive. Weather, river crossings, the occasional rustler. But we've done this route many times." He smiled reassuringly. We'll be fine." The night before his departure, Madeline found herself unable to sleep, troubled by an undefined anxiety. Donning a shawl over her nightgown, she slipped downstairs for a cup of tea, only to find Yates already in the kitchen, studying maps spread across the table. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, looking up at her entrance. "Just restless," she admitted, moving to heat water for tea. "You're well prepared, I see." "Always check the route one last time," he explained, folding the maps. "Weather's been dry, might need to adjust where we water the herd." Madeline busied herself preparing tea, oddly self-conscious in her night attire despite the modest high neck and long sleeves, and the thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders. When she turned, she found Yates watching her with that same unreadable expression she'd noticed when he was recovering from his injury. "I made enough for two," she said, setting a cup before him. "Thank you." He accepted it gratefully, his fingers briefly brushing hers. "Elizabeth will be glad for your company while I'm gone. She worries during drives, though she'd never admit it." "We'll manage fine," Madeline assured him, "though it will be strange with you away." The words slipped out before she could consider their implications. Yates' eyes met hers, something warm kindling in their blue depths. "I'll miss this place," he said softly, "and the people in it." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken sentiment. Madeline found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze, her heart accelerating for reasons she wasn't ready to examine. "You should try to rest," she finally said, breaking the moment. "You have an early start tomorrow," he nodded, rising from the table. "You're right, as usual." At the doorway he paused. "Madeline?" "Yes, I'm glad you're here," he said simply. "Whatever brought you to Val Verde, I'm grateful for it." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her with cooling tea and a tumult of emotions she had no name for. The departure the next morning was organized chaos, horses being saddled, last-minute supplies packed, instructions shouted between ranch hands. Madeline and Elizabeth provided a hearty breakfast for the driving crew, then stood on the porch to see them off. Yates approached them for a final farewell, hat in hand. He hugged Elizabeth tightly, murmuring reassurances in her ear that made her smile despite her worry. Then he turned to Madeline. "The accounts are up to date," she told him, falling back on practicalities to mask the unexpected well of emotion rising within her. "And I've noted all the supply orders that should arrive while you're gone." "Efficient as always," he said with a small smile. Then, more seriously, "Take care of yourself, Madeline." "And you," she replied, voice barely above a whisper. "Come back safely." Something flickered in his eyes, a decision being made, perhaps, and then he stepped forward and took her hand in his, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture, old-fashioned and courtly, sent warmth cascading through her. "Count on it," he promised, then turned and strode to his waiting horse, mounting with the easy grace that came from a lifetime in the saddle. Elizabeth and Madeline watched as the men and cattle moved out, the dust from hundreds of hooves rising golden in the early morning light. Only when they had disappeared from view did Elizabeth speak. "He's never kissed anyone's hand before," she observed mildly. "Not even Mrs. Hargrove's at formal occasions." Madeline felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sure it was just politeness." Elizabeth's knowing look said she believed otherwise, but she mercifully changed the subject. "Well, we have plenty to keep us occupied while they're gone. The preserving isn't finished, and there's the Harvest Festival Committee meeting tomorrow." The days without Yates passed more slowly than Madeline had expected. She filled them with work, completing the seasonal preserving with Elizabeth, deep cleaning rooms that had been neglected during busier times, updating the accounts with meticulous precision. In the evenings, she found herself glancing repeatedly at the study door, half expecting to see Yates enter with questions about the ledgers or observations about the day's work. "You miss him," Elizabeth remarked one evening as they sat by the fire, Madeline distracted from her mending by thoughts she couldn't quite suppress. "The house is certainly quieter," Madeline deflected, focusing intently on her stitches. Elizabeth set aside her book. "Madeline, may I speak frankly?" Something in her tone made Madeline look up. "Of course. My brother cares for you, not as an employee, not even just as a friend." Elizabeth's direct gaze held no judgment, only compassion. "And I believe you care for him too." The simple statement pierced through the careful barriers Madeline had constructed around her feelings. "It's complicated," she managed. "Love usually is," Elizabeth agreed. "But sometimes we complicate it more than necessary." "I came here to marry another man," Madeline reminded her. "What would people think if you found happiness with someone worthy of you instead?" Elizabeth interrupted gently. "The only people whose opinions matter would celebrate it." She reached over to squeeze Madeline's hand. "Just something to consider while he's away." The conversation left Madeline with much to contemplate. Had she developed feelings for Yates Morgan, the man whose unexpected kindness had rescued her from humiliation, whose quiet strength and integrity had impressed her daily, whose rare smiles had increasingly become the brightest moments of her days? The answer, she realized with a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration, was unequivocally yes. But what of his feelings? Elizabeth seemed certain, but Madeline was less so. Yates had been unfailingly kind and respectful, occasionally even tender in his attention to her comfort and happiness. But was that care born of romantic interest or simply his inherent decency? And even if he did harbor feelings for her, what future could they have? She was still, technically, his employee. The potential for gossip and judgment was considerable. These thoughts occupied Madeline throughout the days of Yates' absence. By the time a ranch hand rode in with news that the drive had been successful, and the men would return the following day, she was no closer to resolving her inner conflict, though the relief that swept through her at confirmation of Yates' safe return was telling in itself. Elizabeth, noting Madeline's nervous energy as they prepared for the men's homecoming, suggested they bake extra pies and prepare a special dinner. The activity was a welcome distraction, and soon the house was filled with the comforting aromas of apple cinnamon and roasting meat. "They'll be starved for home cooking," Elizabeth explained as they worked. "Trail food gets tiresome quickly." It was late afternoon when they heard the distant sounds of horses and men's voices. Madeline's heart leapt in her chest, and she smoothed her hair self-consciously before following Elizabeth to the porch. The returning party looked trail-worn and dusty, but triumphant. Yates rode at the front, his hat pushed back on his head, revealing hair in need of trimming and a face bronzed deeper by 2 weeks of sun exposure. When he spotted the women waiting, a smile broke across his features that seemed to illuminate him from within. "Successful drive," Elizabeth called as they dismounted. "Better than expected," Yates confirmed, embracing his sister warmly before turning to Madeline. He hesitated for just a moment, then stepped forward and took her hands in his. "The house looks like it's still standing." "We managed not to burn it down," Madeline replied, her attempt at humor undermined by the breathlessness in her voice. "Welcome home." Something in his expression softened at her use of the word home. He squeezed her hands gently before releasing them. "It smells like apple pie," he observed hopefully. "2 of them," Elizabeth confirmed. "But baths first, all of you." She wrinkled her nose dramatically. 2 weeks on the trail hasn't improved your fragrance." The evening that followed was filled with laughter and stories as the men, cleaned up and ravenous, devoured the welcome home feast. Yates recounted their adventures, a thunderstorm that had nearly scattered the herd, a successful negotiation with the railroad agent that had increased their profits, the antics of a particularly stubborn cow that had escaped 3 times. Throughout the meal, Madeline found her gaze continually drawn to him, noting the animated way he spoke with his hands, the respect evident in how the ranch hands deferred to him, the genuine interest he showed in what had happened at the ranch during his absence. When their eyes occasionally met across the table, the warmth in his blue gaze made her pulse quicken. After the meal, the hands retreated to the bunkhouse with the remaining pie, while Frank stayed for a final cup of coffee to discuss business matters. When he too had gone, Elizabeth yawned conspicuously and announced she was retiring early, leaving Madeline and Yates alone in the parlor. A brief, awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and the awareness of Elizabeth's transparent matchmaking. Finally, Yates spoke. "Would you care to sit on the porch? The evening's mild, and the stars are particularly clear tonight." Madeline nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Outside, the night air was indeed pleasant, with a crescent moon providing just enough light to see by without diminishing the brilliance of the stars. They settled into the porch chairs, the familiar creak of the wood oddly comforting after weeks of change and uncertainty. "I've been thinking," Yates began, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of tension, "about your position here." Madeline's heart sank. Was he about to suggest she move on? Had she misread everything? "Yes," she managed, keeping her voice neutral. "You've been with us almost 3 months now," he continued. "Your original plan was to stay temporarily while considering your next steps." "That's true," she acknowledged, bracing herself for what might come next. Yates shifted in his chair to face her more directly. "I've come to realize that I very much hope your next steps don't take you away from the Double M." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Away from me." The simple statement hung in the air between them, its implications profound. Madeline found herself suddenly unable to form words, her heart racing. "I understand this is unexpected," Yates continued when she didn't immediately respond, "and perhaps unwelcome. If so, I hope we can continue as we have been. But I couldn't return from this drive without telling you that these past months have changed something in me." His voice grew softer. "You've changed something in me, Madeline." "Yates," she finally managed, her own voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything now," he assured her quickly. "Just think about it, about the possibility of a future here, not as my housekeeper but as—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "As whatever we might become to each other given time and choice." The careful phrasing, so respectful of her autonomy, touched Madeline deeply. This was not Edmund Parker's pragmatic marriage proposal or a desperate plea. This was an invitation to explore something genuine, something that had grown naturally between them despite unlikely circumstances. "I have been thinking," she admitted softly, "about my future, about us." Hope kindled in his eyes. And I find myself reluctant to imagine a future away from the Double M." She met his gaze steadily. "Away from you." The tension visibly drained from Yates' shoulders. He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "I'm not asking for promises, Madeline, just a chance to see where this might lead, at your pace, on your terms." "What about the town?" she asked, voicing one of her concerns. "The gossip, given how I arrived." "Anyone worth caring about will see what I see: a remarkable woman who faced adversity with grace and created a new life through her own determination." Yates' conviction was evident in every word. "As for the rest, their opinions matter little to me." Madeline considered this, finding comfort in his certainty. "And what exactly do you see, Yates Morgan?" she asked softly, needing to hear it articulated. He studied her for a long moment, his expression growing tender. "I see a woman of intelligence and quiet strength. Someone who rebuilds when life breaks her plans, who finds beauty in practical things and practicality in beautiful ones." A small smile touched his lips. "Someone who organizes my chaotic ledgers and somehow, in the process, has organized my heart into something more hopeful than it was before." The simple poetry of his words brought unexpected tears to Madeline's eyes. Without conscious thought, she reached out, her hand finding his in the space between their chairs. His fingers immediately entwined with hers, warm and strong and reassuring. "I'd like that chance," she whispered, "to see where this might lead." The smile that illuminated his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. He raised their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, much as he had before leaving for the cattle drive, but this time with clear intent rather than tentative hope. "Then we'll take it one day at a time," he promised. "No rush, no pressure." They sat together under the vast Montana sky, hands linked, discussing nothing of consequence and everything that mattered: his observations about the changing aspen leaves along the trail, her discovery of wild raspberry bushes near the creek, the upcoming harvest festival in town. The conversation flowed easily between them, but now without the careful barriers both had maintained, allowing genuine affection to color their words and expressions. When the night air finally grew too cool to ignore, they reluctantly rose to go inside. At the door, Yates paused, still holding her hand. "May I call on you properly?" he asked. "Sunday afternoon, perhaps? We could ride to the North Meadow. The wildflowers are spectacular this time of year." "I'd like that," Madeline replied, warmth spreading through her at this formal acknowledgement of their changing relationship. He hesitated, then leaned down slowly, giving her ample time to withdraw if she wished. When she didn't, he pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, his lips warm against her skin. "Good night, Madeline," he murmured. "Good night, Yates," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As she prepared for bed that night, Madeline caught her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. The woman looking back at her seemed different, somehow more confident, more centered, her eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like happiness. She touched her cheek where Yates' kiss lingered still, and allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She was falling in love with a Montana rancher who had offered sanctuary when she needed it most, and who now offered something far more precious: a future built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the freedom to choose her own path. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to Montana to marry a stranger and found herself humiliatingly rejected. Yet that very rejection had led her to a man whose worth exceeded anything she could have imagined, and to a life more fulfilling than the security she had originally sought. Perhaps, she thought as she drifted towards sleep, there was providence in life's disappointments after all. The following days brought subtle but significant changes to life at the Double M. Yates began taking his meals at the table rather than grabbing coffee and biscuits on his way out the door. He found reasons to visit the house during the day: questions about supply orders that could have waited, updates on ranch activities that weren't strictly necessary. Each interaction was marked by a new awareness between them, a gentle testing of boundaries that were slowly, thoughtfully being redrawn. Elizabeth observed these developments with poorly concealed satisfaction, though she refrained from direct comment. Instead, she created opportunities for them to be alone together, suddenly remembering errands in town, discovering urgent correspondence that required immediate attention in another room, retiring early with transparent yawns about her exhausting day. Sunday dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the promised ride. After church services, during which Madeline noticed several curious glances when Yates sat beside her instead of with the other ranchers, they returned to the Double M for the midday meal. Afterward, Yates suggested they set out for the North Meadow. "I've packed a small picnic," Elizabeth announced, producing a basket with suspicious readiness. "Nothing elaborate, just some cookies and lemonade." "How thoughtful of you," Madeline replied, exchanging an amused glance with Yates at his sister's transparent matchmaking. Yates had saddled 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding, and a gentle mare named Daisy that Elizabeth sometimes rode. He helped Madeline mount, his hands strong and respectful at her waist, then swung into his own saddle with practiced ease. The ride to the North Meadow took them through stands of aspen beginning to turn golden with autumn and across several shallow streams where the horses paused to drink. Madeline, who had learned to ride as a girl but had few opportunities in Boston, found herself enjoying the freedom of movement and the magnificent surroundings. "You ride well," Yates observed as they crossed a grassy expanse at an easy trot. "My grandfather kept horses at his Vermont property," she explained. "I spent summers there as a child." "It shows," he replied appreciatively. "Most city women struggle their first time on Western trails." "I'm adaptable," Madeline said with a small smile. "Indeed you are," Yates agreed, his admiring glance warming her more effectively than the afternoon sunshine. The North Meadow, when they reached it, proved worth the journey. Nestled between pine-covered hills, it stretched for nearly a mile, carpeted with late wildflowers in purple, yellow, and white. A small creek meandered along its eastern edge, bordered by willows and cottonwoods showing hints of autumn color. They dismounted near the creek, securing the horses where they could graze, and spread a blanket from the saddlebag in a sunny spot with a view across the meadow. As they settled with Elizabeth's picnic offerings, Madeline was struck by the peaceful beauty surrounding them. "It's magnificent," she said softly, "like something from a painting." "One of my favorite places on the ranch," Yates agreed. "I found it during my first winter here, covered in snow, came back in spring and discovered all this." He gestured toward the wildflowers. "Seemed like a miracle after the gray eastern winters I was used to." "Do you ever miss Pennsylvania?" Madeline asked, curious about this part of him. He considered the question thoughtfully. "Sometimes I miss what it represented, my parents, my childhood, a certain simplicity of purpose. But not the place itself." He looked around at the expansive landscape. "Montana gets in your blood, the space, the challenges, the freedom of it." "I understand that better now," Madeline admitted. "When I first arrived, everything seemed so vast, overwhelming, but now I find it invigorating." "And Boston?" Yates asked, his tone careful. "Do you miss it?" "Parts of it," she acknowledged honestly. "The libraries, the concerts, certain friends, but not as much as I expected to." She met his gaze directly. "I've found unexpected compensations here." The warmth in his eyes told her. He understood her meaning perfectly. They shared the cookies and lemonade, conversation flowing easily between topics both profound and mundane, books they had enjoyed, his plans for expanding the herd next year, her memories of teaching in Boston, his experiences during the war, shared sparingly, she noticed, with the reticence of many veterans. As the afternoon waned, they walked along the creek, gathering late wildflowers that Madeline tucked into her belt. When Yates offered his hand to help her across a fallen log, he didn't release it afterward, and they continued their stroll with fingers intertwined, a simple intimacy that felt both new and somehow familiar. Near a stand of birch trees, they paused to watch a family of deer cautiously approach the creek on the opposite bank. Standing close beside Yates, Madeline felt a profound contentment that transcended the beauty of their surroundings. This, she realized, was what had been missing in her carefully planned future with Edmund Parker, not just affection, but this sense of rightness, of being precisely where she was meant to be, beside someone whose presence felt as necessary as air. As if sensing her thoughts, Yates turned to her, his expression serious. "Madeline, there's something I need to say." She faced him fully, noting the intensity in his blue eyes. "What is it?" "When you arrived in Val Verde, it was a coincidence that I overheard your conversation with Winters. Or perhaps Providence." He took both her hands in his touch gentle but secure. "But every day since then has been a choice, my choice to know you better, to understand the remarkable woman you are, to—" He paused, seeming to gather courage, "to fall in love with you." Though she had begun to suspect the depth of his feelings, hearing them articulated so directly made Madeline's breath catch. "Yates, please, let me finish," he requested softly. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just want you to know the truth of my heart. You came to Montana expecting one future and found another. I want to be part of that future, Madeline, in whatever way you'll allow." The sincerity in his voice, the careful respect for her autonomy even in this declaration of love, confirmed everything she had come to believe about his character. Here was a man who saw her clearly and valued what he saw not as a convenient wife or an efficient housekeeper, but as a whole person whose happiness mattered to him as much as his own. "I came to Montana expecting a partnership of convenience," she said slowly, organizing her thoughts. "What I found instead was the possibility of something far more valuable." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm falling in love with you too, Yates Morgan. It wasn't planned or expected, but it's the truest thing I know." The joy that transformed his face was breathtaking. He raised one hand to gently cup her cheek, his touch reverent. "May I kiss you, Madeline, please?" she whispered, her heart racing with anticipation. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, then pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. It was brief, a question more than a demand, but it contained a promise of devotion that shook her to her core. When they separated, Yates rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his eyes closed as if memorizing the sensation. Then he straightened, his expression a mixture of joy and wonder. "I never expected this," he admitted. "When Parker broke his promise to you, I only wanted to offer an alternative to you returning east defeated. I never imagined that the mail-order bride would choose you instead." Madeline finished with a small smile, recalling his words from their first meeting. "Exactly that," he agreed, his own smile widening. "I'm grateful every day for Parker's foolishness." "As am I," Madeline replied softly, though it didn't feel like good fortune at the time. They remained in the meadow until the lengthening shadows warned of approaching evening, talking and occasionally sharing soft kisses that grew more confident with repetition. By unspoken agreement, they kept their developing relationship to themselves that evening, though Elizabeth's knowing smile when they returned suggested she had already guessed the changed nature of their connection. Over the following weeks, Yates and Madeline's courtship progressed with the measured pace of two people who understood the value of building a solid foundation. He called on her formally twice a week, taking her on rides across the ranch property, picnicking by the creek, or simply sitting on the porch discussing books and dreams and memories. On Sundays after church, they often visited the Hargroves or other neighbors, gradually introducing Madeline as someone of importance to Yates rather than merely his employee. The transition wasn't without complications. There were raised eyebrows and whispered comments from some quarters misses. Tanner predictably led the speculation about the jilted mail-order bride, and the convenient arrangement at the Double M. But the majority of the community, following the example of respected families like the Hargroves, accepted the developing relationship with approval or indifference. Madeline continued her work managing the household and accounts, though now as an acknowledged partner in the ranch's success rather than an employee. October brought the Harvest Festival, where Yates proudly escorted her to the community dance, his hand protective at the small of her back as they navigated the crowded hall. "People are watching," Madeline murmured as he led her onto the dance floor for a waltz. "Let them," Yates replied, his arm secure around her waist. "I'm dancing with the most beautiful woman here. They should look." His unabashed admiration made her blush but also stand taller. This was part of what she loved about him, his straightforward honesty, his refusal to be governed by others' opinions when he believed himself in the right. As they moved smoothly across the floor, Yates proving to be an unexpectedly graceful dancer, Madeline caught sight of a familiar face watching from across the room, Edmund Parker, with a plump, expensively dressed woman beside him who must be the widow he had chosen over her. Yates followed her gaze. "Parker," he identified quietly. "With Margaret Wilson Parker now, I suppose. Would you prefer to leave?" Madeline considered the question seriously, then shook her head. "No, I have nothing to be ashamed of." As the dance ended, Parker approached them, his expression uncomfortable but determined. "Miss Miller," he greeted her with a slight bow. "You're looking well." "Mr. Parker," she acknowledged coolly. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell until Yates extended his hand. "Morgan," he introduced himself, though they clearly knew each other by reputation. "Yates Morgan." Parker shook it briefly. "Yes, I know. Your cattle fetched a good price at the Miles City auction, I hear." "They did," Yates confirmed, his arm slipping protectively around Madeline's waist. "But I've been fortunate in more important matters recently." The implication was clear. Parker's gaze shifted between them, understanding dawning in his expression. "I see. Well," he cleared his throat. "I merely wanted to express my regret for any inconvenience caused by our changed circumstances, Miss Miller." "No regrets necessary, Mr. Parker," Madeline replied with newfound confidence. "Everything worked out precisely as it should have." Something like surprise flickered across Parker's face at her composed response. He nodded awkwardly and retreated to his wife, who had been watching the exchange with poorly disguised curiosity. "Are you all right?" Yates asked quietly as they moved toward the refreshment table. "Perfectly," Madeline assured him, surprised to find it was true. Seeing Edmund Parker again had produced none of the humiliation or anger she might have expected. Instead, she felt only a detached pity for the man who had unknowingly done her the greatest favor of her life by rejecting her. Later that evening, as they drove home under a canopy of stars, Madeline rested her head against Yates' shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she first stepped off the train in Val Verde. "Penny for your thoughts," Yates said softly, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I was thinking about fate," she replied. "How the worst moments sometimes lead to the best outcomes." He pressed a gentle kiss to her hair. "In this case, I'd say fate has excellent taste." November brought the first snow, transforming the landscape into a pristine wonderland that took Madeline's breath away. Ranch operations slowed with the changing season, allowing Yates more time at the house. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud or playing checkers with Elizabeth, who had developed a sudden interest in visiting her friend Sarah Hargrove whenever the weather permitted, leaving them alone with increasing frequency. On a particularly beautiful Sunday afternoon, with the world outside glistening under a fresh layer of snow, Yates suggested a sleigh ride. He had prepared an old cutter with buffalo robes and heated bricks, hitching his steadiest horse to the polished runners. "It's beautiful," Madeline exclaimed as he helped her into the sleigh, tucking the warm robes around her. The ride was magical, gliding silently across the snow-covered landscape, the only sounds the soft jingle of the harness bells and the occasional call of winter birds. Yates guided them to a viewpoint overlooking the entire valley, where the Double M Ranch building stood as a testament to what determination and hard work could build from nothing. As they admired the view, Madeline sensed a nervous energy in Yates that was uncharacteristic of his usual calm competence. He adjusted the reins unnecessarily, cleared his throat twice without speaking, and seemed unusually focused on the distant horizon. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked. "Wrong? No." He took a deep breath, then turned to face her fully. "Madeline, these past months have been the happiest of my life." The serious tone of his voice made her heart accelerate. "Mine too," she replied softly. "When you arrived in Val Verde, you were seeking a partnership, a shared future built on mutual respect and common goals." He took her gloved hands in his. "I'm hoping you might still want that, but with me instead." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it revealed a simple but elegant ring, a sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds set in gold. "This was my mother's," he explained. "My father saved for 3 years to give it to her." Emotion welled in Madeline's throat as she understood the significance of the moment, the heritage he was offering to share with her. "Madeline Miller," Yates continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes, "I love you with everything I am. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to hope for this moment, the reality of it here in this beautiful setting, with this man she had come to love, so deeply overwhelmed her. Tears spilled onto her cheeks, instantly freezing in the cold air. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Yates, I would be honored to be your wife." The joy that illuminated his face rivaled the brilliance of the sun on snow surrounding them. With hands that trembled slightly, he removed her glove and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. "I love you," she told him, the words feeling both momentous and utterly natural. His response was a kiss that contained all the promise of their future together, tender and passionate, secure and thrilling, a covenant more binding than any formal vow. When they finally broke apart, both breathless despite the cold air, Yates pressed his forehead to hers in that gesture she had come to cherish. "I never expected you," he murmured. "Never thought to find this kind of happiness." "Nor I," she admitted, "but now I can't imagine any other path." They returned to the ranch to share their news with Elizabeth, who embraced them both with tears of happiness, confessing she had been hoping for this outcome since Madeline's first week at the Double M. "I knew you were perfect for each other," she declared triumphantly. "Anyone with eyes could see it." "Apparently we were the last to notice," Yates laughed, his arm secure around Madeline's waist, unwilling to be separated from her even for a moment. The news spread quickly through Val Verde. The Hargroves were among the first to offer congratulations, Sarah embracing Madeline warmly and whispering, "See, sometimes the journey leads exactly where you're meant to be, just not how you expected to get there." They were married on Christmas Eve in the small Val Verde church, decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons for the season. Elizabeth stood as Madeline's attendant, while Daniel Hargrove served as Yates' best man. The bride wore a new dress of deep blue silk that matched her eyes, and carried a bouquet of winter evergreens and dried white flowers that Elizabeth had preserved from the North Meadow, where Yates had first declared his love. Snow fell gently outside as they exchanged vows, Yates' voice steady and sure as he promised to cherish and protect her all the days of his life. Madeline's clear and unwavering as she pledged her love and faithfulness in return. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering of friends and neighbors erupted in warm applause, genuine affection evident in their celebration. The wedding supper that followed at the Double M was a joyous affair, with tables set up in the parlor and kitchen to accommodate everyone. Sarah Hargrove had coordinated a feast worthy of the occasion, while Frank Donnelly and several ranch hands provided music for dancing afterward. As evening deepened, Madeline found a quiet moment with Elizabeth, who was watching the festivities with evident satisfaction. "Happy?" Elizabeth asked, squeezing her new sister-in-law's hand. "More than I knew was possible," Madeline confirmed. "Thank you for everything, Elizabeth. For welcoming me from the beginning, for encouraging us both, for conveniently disappearing whenever you needed privacy." Elizabeth supplied with a mischievous smile. Madeline laughed. "For that too. You've made my brother happier than I've ever seen him," Elizabeth said more seriously. "That's thanks enough." Later, as the celebration continued, Yates found Madeline standing by the window, watching the snow illuminate the darkness outside. He slipped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her gently against his chest. "Having regrets, Mrs. Morgan?" he murmured close to her ear. The new name sent a thrill through her. "Only that I didn't get off the train in Val Verde years ago," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Everything in its time," he said philosophically, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I admit I'm grateful Parker was such a fool." "As am I," Madeline agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "His loss was decidedly my gain." Yates smiled down at her, his expression one of profound contentment. "No, my love, the gain was entirely mine." Spring arrived at the Double M with its usual promise of renewal. The land awakening from winter's sleep with vibrant green growth and the sounds of new life. The creek ran high with snowmelt, wildflowers began appearing in sheltered hollows, and the first calves of the season wobbled on uncertain legs beside their watchful mothers. In the ranch house, Madeline Morgan moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman comfortable in her domain, directing the spring cleaning with good-natured authority. 4 months of marriage had settled her fully into her role as the mistress of Double M, though she still maintained the account books with the same meticulous care she had shown as an employee. The greatest change, however, was internal, a deep contentment that came from building a life with Yates, from the daily joy of waking beside him and sharing both the challenges and triumphs of ranch life. Their partnership had blossomed into something stronger and more satisfying than either had imagined possible, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Elizabeth had moved into the smaller cabin originally built for the foreman, giving the newlyweds privacy while remaining an integral part of ranch operations. Her frequent visits kept the household lively, her teasing affection for both her brother and sister-in-law unchanged by the new arrangements. On a particularly beautiful May morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, Madeline was preparing breakfast when Yates entered from his early check of the new calves. He hung his hat on the peg by the door, then crossed to her, slipping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below her ear. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan," he murmured, his voice still holding a note of wonder at the reality of their marriage. "Good morning yourself," she replied, turning in his embrace to return his kiss properly. "How are the new arrivals? Thriving," he reported, reluctantly releasing her to wash up at the basin. "The Johnson heifer finally delivered twins, both healthy." Frank's beside himself with pride, like he had something to do with it. Madeline laughed, returning to the biscuits she was cutting. He's invested in every aspect of this ranch. You're fortunate to have him. I'm fortunate in many things, Yates replied, his gaze warm as it rested on her. Speaking of which, I've been thinking about that east pasture expansion we discussed. Their conversation turned to ranch business as they ate breakfast together, the easy exchange of ideas reflecting their true partnership. When Yates had finished and was preparing to head back out, Madeline called him back with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her hands clasped tightly before her. Concern immediately crossed his face. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," she assured him quickly. "Nothing wrong at all, in fact." A smile bloomed across her features. "I've seen Dr. Collins. We're going to have a baby, Yates, in late November." For a moment, he simply stared at her, processing the information. Then joy transformed his expression, his eyes brightening with tears as he crossed the room in 2 long strides and gathered her into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." He pulled back to look at her face, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You're sure?" "You're feeling well," she nodded, her own eyes moist with happiness. "Very sure. And yes, I feel wonderful." He kissed her then, pouring all his love and joy into the connection between them. When they finally separated, both breathless, he rested one hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" she asked, covering his hand with her own. "For coming to Montana, for choosing me, for this family we're building together." His blue eyes held hers, sincere and adoring, for everything. As Madeline stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the home she loved and held by the man who had helped her find her true place in the world, she thought again of that moment of despair at the Val Verde train station. How close she had come to turning back, to accepting defeat and returning to a life that would have been so much smaller than the one she now embraced. "I'm the thankful one," she told her husband softly, "for that day in the tea shop when you offered me a choice instead of charity." "Then you're free to choose me," you said. She raised a hand to his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of his morning stubble beneath her palm. "It was the best choice I ever made." Yates turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "And one I'm grateful for every day of my life." Outside, the Montana spring continued its renewal, promising growth and abundance in the months ahead. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Yates and Madeline Morgan celebrated their own promise, fulfilled a love born from unlikely circumstances, nurtured through respect and understanding, and now expanding to embrace new life, in a home built by choice rather than convention. In the years that followed, the Double M prospered, expanding its operations and its family. Their son James was born that November, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful expression. 2 years later, a daughter named Catherine joined the family, followed eventually by another son, William. Madeline's initial position as housekeeper was long forgotten, as she became known throughout the county for her shrewd business acumen and the educational initiatives she spearheaded in Val Verde. The school she helped establish eventually bore her name, honoring her transformation from mail order bride to respected community pillar. Elizabeth married Frank Donnelly in a surprising but ultimately perfect match, moving into the main house when Yates built a larger family home closer to the creek. Their extended family gatherings became legendary, with the Hargroves and other neighbors joining for celebrations that strengthened the bonds of community. Edmund Parker and his wife eventually sold their ranch and moved east, their brief role in bringing Yates and Madeline together fading into an anecdote occasionally shared with close friends, the story of how rejection had led to the greatest happiness either could have imagined. And on summer evenings, when the day's work was done and their children played in the yard, Yates and Madeline often sat together on their porch, hands linked as they had been that first night when possibilities were just beginning to unfold. They watched the Montana sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, grateful for the unexpected path that had brought them together and the love that had made them whole.